Joined with Felix Frankfurter in 1940,
48.
48 term. How did that happen?
Well, I had clerked a year for Judge Goodrich on the Third Circuit, and then one day Henry Hart, who was a professor at the Harvard Law School, who I don't think I ever took a course from, called me up and asked me whether I'd like to be Justice Frankfurter's law clerk the next year. And I'd met Justice Frankfurter because he'd come up to the law school to some of the law review dinners. And obviously I said yes. And he hung the phone up, and I never heard any more about it. You know, no interview, no nothing. And I finally, a good friend of mine at the law school, Professor Paul Fraun, who I had taken courses under, I called him, and he said, well, gee, I better call Henry Hart and see what happened. And he called Henry Hart, and apparently Henry Hart said, gee, Paul, that Coleman is not as bright as you said he was, that I assume that once I asked him, he said yes, that he knew it was a close deal. And so he called me back and said, you know, I'm supposed to report work on the 1st of September. And then I got a call about the same time from Elliot Richardson, who'd been clerking for Learned Hand, and he was going to be the other clerk. And so that's how I got to be just right. I think, but Paul Fraun had been very nice to me, and I had been very successful in the two courses I took for him. And I had finished first in my class, so therefore I think that one of those things that just happened.
Was there any sense of history there?
Well, I would, you know, I guess in retrospect you say, after all, Washington was still a segregated city then. I remember there was one day when we were working and the court was not open, but the justices were working. It's one of those semi-holiday, but the lunchroom at the court was closed. And I was working on an antitrust case with Justice Frankfurter, and Elliot stuck his head in the door and said, the law clerks have decided to go down to the Mayflower for lunch. And I said, well, give me 10 minutes, I'll join you. So when I came out 10 minutes later, Elliot said, oh, gee, it's kind of late, let's go down to the Union Station. And I went just thinking that, you know, we were late. I then got back to the office, and I had noticed that the justice had tears in his eyes. I forget why. Because Elliot had told him a story that he'd called the Mayflower, and the Mayflower said, well, we can't take a black. And so, you know, Frankfurter certainly felt very offended at that. On the other hand, I had a good time because I certainly socialized with the other law clerks, and Frankfurter had a lot of people in, so I just felt, but life was different then. Yeah. And but I just, of course, I had a great mother and father, and they just felt that that this was something that had to change. Also, that they spent a lot of time talking about people who had been, strikingly successful in the world, even though they were black. I think I knew about Pushkin, the great Russian writer, before I knew about some of the great American writers, because my mother and father, and Pushkin, most Americans don't realize, was black, and also the Dumas brothers and father. I knew about them, and knew about the Queen of Sheba, whatever it is, and the rest of them. So I, just had two-cent Louverture. So we had, and then I, had come up under a situation. My great-great-grandfather on my mother's side fought with Grant at Lookout Mountain, and and they operated the Underground Railroad out of St. Louis, Missouri. So we had just had, and my mother was, Thurgood Marshall was born in the house right next to where my mother lived. So so we had just a different experience.
You come on to court in 1948, talking about some of the personalities of some of the judges. What did you know about Robert Jackson.
Well, he was obviously one that Mr. Justice Frankfurt admired very much. He was awfully good. I think the general consensus was that he was probably the best writer on the court. On the other hand, by that time, there had been some of the tension between Black and Mr. Justice Jackson, and there had been some controversy about him going to Nuremberg and that sort of thing. And also, it was clear that Douglas thought that maybe he would be the president of the United States, and he knew that Jackson perhaps would be. So there was that tension, but he was greatly respected, wrote quite well, and had a tremendous personality. And I had actually at the law school, one of my classmates, he was also on the law review, was Bill Jackson, although I don't think anybody knew that the justice was Bill Jackson's father until maybe the end of his time he was on the law review. Something came up and somebody said, "Oh, gee, is that your father?" He said, "Yes," but he was very quiet, never mentioned it, never talked about it.
Did you have any personal interaction with Justice Jackson?
Oh yeah, things were different then in the sense that oft times if you were walking down the hall, a justice would ask you to come in to see him. And he also, one of his law clerks, I think, was Jim Marsh one of his law clerks? Yeah, well, from Philadelphia, and I knew him. And so I would go and see Jim, and we'd argue and talk about issues, and he would, he'd treat you like you were one of his law clerks, and he and Frankfurter were very close, so a lot. So I saw a lot of him. Well, he never asked me to go out and have a drink with him, something, but we associated a lot together.
What about relationships Frankfurter and Hugo Black, or Frankfurter and Douglas?
Well, Frankfurter and Douglas, they hardly spoke to each other. I mean, by the time I got there, it was a terrible relationship. With Hugo Black, they always were very friendly and respected each other. I mean, they disagreed sometime, the fight on whether you incorporate the first 8 amendments in the 14th Amendment. I mean, that was something that Frankfurter thought was not right, and we had those things, but they had great, and I remember one time I was walking down, and Justice Black saw me and took me into his office to try to convince me on some matter that he was right and Frankfurter was wrong, and as he spelled it out, I said, "Gee, Mr. Justice Black, if you would repeat everything you said slowly, you will convince yourself you're wrong." At which point Black said, "Gee, you better go back to see Frankfurter." And apparently Frankfurter next day said, "Gee, I talked to Justice Black, and he said, gee, that Coleman is really a very relaxed young man." So we got, and also Black had a very good law clerk. What's his name? Come on. His father was a judge in Alabama. He went on to be a judge. Truman Hobbs. No, his father was a congressman who wrote the Hobbs something bill. And so I knew Truman very well, and also Lou Pollock I knew. He clerked for Rutledge, and so we got together. But it was completely different than it is today. I mean, you really went, and you talked to each other, and you try to rewrite part of people's opinion and that sort of thing.
But thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you.